Now it's my pleasure to invite David Bulman from the World Bank to present the World Development Report. Here you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks in particular to V-Dem. We've collaborated with V-Dem in many ways on this project, the World Development Report. So if you look at the report, we use V-Dem data throughout. In addition, V-Dem helped with a background paper on sequencing of accountability. And in addition to that, we collaborated with V-Dem on a new pilot survey on elite interactions and elite actors, which we did in 12 countries and hope to extend later on. Thank you also to all of you in the audience. Looking at the list of participants and the bibliography of the WDR, you can see an uncannily high correlation, which is both very exciting but also a bit daunting as we have to present your own research back to you. With that said, it's useful to explain what a WDR is. So the World Development Report is the World Bank's flagship annual publication. It is not meant really to present new research, although there's a bit of new research, but mostly it's meant as a synthesis of existing research in a way that is useful to development practitioners. So with this topic in particular, governance and the law, a lot of the things we talk about will be maybe old hat to many of you in the audience, but they're very new and contentious internally at the bank and among other development practitioners. So we hope, as we move forward, that we can have your ideas on how to collaborate and move this research agenda forward and work together with you between the practitioner and academic space. So I'm going to speak now for about 15 or 20 minutes and just go over the basic conceptual framework of the WDR and main implications and takeaways. And then during the lunch session, my colleague Marco Larizza and I will talk much more in depth, particularly on issues related to citizen participation and violence, but what the implications of the report are using examples. So this World Development Report can be seen as part of a trilogy under the former chief economist Kaushik Basu that look at how to make policies more effective for development. So 2 years ago, the focus was on mind, society, and behavior. So taking insights from behavioral economics and insights from psychology to make policies more effective. Last year, the report was on digital dividends, which was focusing on technology and how to use digital technologies to make policies more effective. And this year, we're focusing on governance and the law. So the team, and World Development Reports have large teams and a lot of consultation, but the team this year included economists, political scientists, lawyers, historians, so a wide range of disciplines, and bringing findings together from all of these disciplines to shed light on how to use governance to make policies more effective. So I'm going to start with a couple of puzzles at this question of policy effectiveness. So first, we know that energy subsidies are highly regressive. Generalized energy subsidies are highly regressive, and they induce inefficient energy use. And yet we see that in many countries, they persist. So why do they persist? Second, why are technically sound policies often ineffective? Now, we know that there's better and better data. There are more and more robust statistical and methodological techniques. So in many senses, we should have better policies. But these sound policies are often ineffective in practice. So if we think about teacher absenteeism, we know that it reduces student learning outcomes. And yet, new approaches, new policies based on new contractual obligations that have been developed by very good economists have failed during implementation stages. The question is why? We're losing the titles here, but this question is, why are second best policies often more effective than first best policies? So if we think about the issue of climate change and environmental degradation, this is an issue that faces all countries and individuals throughout the world. Yet, first best approaches that rely on sanctions, such as the Kyoto Protocol, have not gotten buy-in and have not been effective, whereas second best approaches based on promises with nothing verifiable and no sanctions, such as the Paris Agreement, seem to have wider agreement and be more effective. So in this report, we try to go beyond what we can call the easy answers. These are things that we often hear in the halls of the World Bank explaining why policies have failed. And we think that these easy answers are ways to ask the really important underlying questions that the report tries to get at. So the first easy answer is that policies fail because they do not follow best practice. And really, we want to turn this on its head and ask, why does a policy that works in one context not work in a different context? The second question is about lack of capacity. So policies fail because of a lack of capacity. And we acknowledge that at any given point in time, states have a certain stock of capacity and therefore may be unable to implement certain policies. But over time, capacity is in many ways a flow that is selected by those in power. And if we think about capacity this way, we can help to explain sort of pockets of effectiveness and asymmetrical capacity development, as well as, for example, in many African countries, the underdevelopment of statistical agencies that can be seen as posing a challenge to those in power. And finally, and perhaps most common, we hear that policies fail because of a lack of political will. And we argue that we should instead think, why are policies that are incentive incompatible with those in power expected to work? And why don't we design policies that are incentive compatible? So we try to go underneath current policies and look at the underlying determinants of effectiveness, which we believe are related to governance. Now, in doing so, we look at policy effectiveness for specific development outcomes. And in particular, we look at the freedom from violence or security, growth, and equity. And this is the normative framework that we use in the report. So we know that governance has intrinsic value, and many of governance's components have intrinsic value. But we look instead at the instrumental side. Now, there are challenges to this, of course, but we believe that this gives us much more traction in speaking to many of our clients and our client states. So, for example, we use much of the varieties of democracy data, but if I've presented this report in certain countries that should go unnamed, where government officials see varieties of democracy as a source at the bottom of graphs and get upset. We're not trying to become a democracy. Why are you advocating this with us? So instead now we focus on V-Dem instead of varieties of democracy. But it shows the challenges within which we operate, but also why we choose this instrumental approach. So using this instrumental approach, we look at governance as a process. So the process by which actors reach and sustain agreements to adopt and to implement policies. And we argue that this action happens in what we call the policy arena. So it's a conceptual space in which actors interact. And that this is where a lot of the action in determining policy effectiveness takes place. I'm going to provide sort of a very brief roadmap of 3 of our key findings. So this is summarizing 3 key findings that I'll talk very briefly about now, and then at lunch we'll go into more depth with real examples. First key finding, or key sort of takeaway, is that we take a functional approach, and so arguing that functions are more important than form. And in particular, these functions that need to induce certain behaviors related to commitment, coordination, and cooperation. And in the next slide, I'll talk more about these. The second point is that power matters. Now, again, to this crowd, that's probably quite obvious. In the bank, when you say power, everyone thinks we're talking about the electricity sector, of course. So this is very new for us, and trying to push this is actually difficult, as we've found. But we think that power asymmetries in particular are important, and obviously there are always power asymmetries. But when governance fails, those asymmetries tend to manifest in problems of exclusion, capture, and clientelism, which again we'll talk about briefly. And finally, there's a lot, in a lot of literature that's come out, there's a lot of focus on persistence and a pessimistic take. Now, obviously, many of these dynamics we're talking about can be highly persistent, and they have feedback loops that make policies tend to stay ineffective. But we do believe that harnessing the agency of different types of actors and focusing on these entry points of incentives, preferences, and contestability can lead to change, particularly incremental change. So we take a more optimistic view. So thinking first about form versus function, the report is called Governance in the Law. There is an entire chapter on the law, which we're not going to do justice to today, but I encourage you to read. In the report, law refers to formal state law, but we recognize that the point of law is to change people's behavior. And formal state law, whether it does that or not, or how it changes behavior, is entirely based on how it interacts with other existing norms and laws in society. So this is sort of this overlapping set of international laws, customary laws, social norms. Now, how those interact determines sort of how laws are implemented. So if we think, for example, about gender quotas, here we see these blue dots are the years in which gender quotas were passed. The green dots are when they were actually implemented, and the red little X's are countries that have never actually implemented the laws that they've passed. So if we think, if we showed this first country is Bangladesh, so over 20, 25 years between passage and implementation, This is South Korea, which has still not implemented or as of 2015, had not implemented its gender quota. So wide heterogeneity, and we try to understand these ties of these gaps by thinking more about the interaction of these different types of rules and laws. But so the key is that laws on paper need to actually change people's behavior. And in the report, we think about changing people's behavior in 3 specific ways. And this is largely drawn from the game theoretic literature. So the ability to ensure credible commitment despite changing policies. And you can think here about property rights or counter-cyclical fiscal policies, et cetera, about whether if people don't believe that policies will be committed to, they're not going to actually change their behavior. Second example is so these coordination and cooperation are forms of collective action. On the coordination side, the key is that there are multiple equilibria. So on coordination, you want to change expectations so that to move from a lower equilibrium to a higher equilibrium. In order to do that, so for instance, we can think here the most often cited example is investment. So Rosenstein, Rodin, and then sort of Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny talking about big push investments and how it doesn't make any sense for one firm to invest unless all firms do. So you need to change expectations of all firms, applying a role of the state. Now, in the report, we often talk about law as a focal point for coordinating expectations. So in a sense, this is where our law comes in very frequently. And finally, on cooperation, we're talking about free rider problems and how to ensure voluntary compliance. So it makes sense for an individual to free ride. It's not an equilibrium problem, but how do you actually ensure that they will not? And this can be in changing preferences, maybe in changing their incentives. We see this especially with examples like tax compliance. Now, the effective performance of these functions is often undermined by power asymmetries. And here we talk in particular about 3 types of asymmetry, that are manifestations of these asymmetries: exclusion, capture, and clientelism. And so thinking back to the examples that we led with, you can think about exclusion at the extreme sense in the environmental case as future generations being excluded from decision-making and therefore not having their interests taken into account. More sort of practically, you can also think about within countries that engage in these these treaties have not always consulted their domestic constituents that are essential for implementation. In terms of capture, and we think about energy subsidies, often the reason that these persist is that large firms benefit the most from them, and these large firms have captured state policies. And if we think about clientelism, some of the problem with teacher absenteeism has to do with, in some countries, the large and excessive power of teachers' unions that control large voting blocks, and in these clientelistic relationships, politicians are unwilling to really challenge them. So, the third point after power matters is that change is possible. We need to harness the agency of various actors in order to produce change. So we have 3 different chapters in the report looking at elite bargains, so how elites come together to sustain agreements and why it is sometimes in their interests to adopt rules that actually constrain them. Citizen engagement, where we talk about different forms of citizen participation, voting, social organization, political organization, public deliberation, and how citizens can form coalitions with each other and with other elites to affect policies. And finally, international influence. This is the role of international actors, but also the spread of international norms, the role of aid. So an entire chapter looking at these issues. Now, these actors are the ones driving change, and they do it through 3 entry points that we focus on: incentives, preferences, and beliefs, and enhancing contestability. So in terms of incentives, we are looking at, so here just very brief examples, looking at incentives, looking at elite bargains. So this is from the elite survey that we'll talk more about at lunch that we do with V-Dem, but cost of losing power, it can change the incentives that elites face, and we'll talk more about that later, but that can lead to changes in laws. With preferences and beliefs, nice spelling on preferences, the international norm diffusion we think about with the global actors, international actors, that is looking at the spread of human rights language, and how this by right language has become more of an international norm. And finally, with contestability, we're thinking here about citizen participation in the growing space, or possibly shrinking space more recently, for media and CSOs. So just to summarize, and then we'll talk in more depth because there are no real examples here at lunch, but we see this as sort of this large endogenous process with many feedback loops. So we start on the right side, where decisions within the policy arena affect development outcomes through these functions that we're talking about. And development outcomes themselves can change power or can lead to sort of status quo bias that feeds back into the policy arena. This is what we call the outcome game, and it's generally what we focused on in much of development in the World Bank, how to design policies to change development outcomes. But we argue that really we need to look as well at the left side of this chart at how policies change the rules by which in which actors in the policy arena engage. Also dealing with sort of functions, but these rules can be laws and norms for how decisions themselves are made. And we argue this rules game is where much of the action is, and where the bank in particular needs to think much more when we're designing policies and interventions. So just really briefly to conclude, in terms of thinking what are the implications for the policy design cycle within the bank and thinking about operations, generally we start just at this design stage of how do we get policies? What are the policies that we're going to implement to change development outcomes? We argue that we need to step back much further to diagnose problems using this functional approach, to think about the power asymmetries that might undermine these effective implementation of these functions, and then really think about the interventions that will affect those power asymmetries themselves, rather than just the proximate factor of the policy. So hopefully this has provided a little bit of food for thought and enough room to talk later, and we'll provide more depth at lunch. This is just an outline that I'm not going to go over of the report itself, hopefully inspiring you to read a chapter here or there. Thank you very much. Thanks, Stefan.